welcome back. I thought this would be a fun little topic that we can just talk about or whatever. I don't know. I had this on my mind for a while, and I want to give my hot takes and put them out there so people can disagree with me. But joking aside, I thought it'd just be a fun discussion idea. So I'm here to rate all the brand new code paths and all the code units that we are getting for Part 3. At the end of all of the unit rankings, I'll rank it based on what I believe is the most valuable path right now. And I do need to preface this ahead of time because there are going to be a lot of maybe questionable thoughts and placements or whatever. This is mainly going to be based on their viability in the meta right now. If we're talking general use, most, if not all of these skills are completely viable and usable. That's why I don't think it's fun to rank it that way, because I can look at something like Gatekeeper, for example, right? And I can inherit Harsh Command Plus, Close Reversal, Joint Drive Defense, and that's already like a core kit for Arena, right? Because obviously looking at it, there is a lot of value there. However, I don't think it's going to be fun if I just look at it and be like, yeah, you know what, you can use skill for Arena, it's good there, blah, 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 blah. Or if I look at the skill, it's like, oh yeah, you can probably clear like an Inferno or Abyssal if you get Timed Pulse or whatever, blah, 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 blah. Because again, obviously, if you look at all these skills, none of them are necessarily bad by any means. Sure, you can pick out like maybe one or two or bad ones, but outside of that, like, they're all fairly usable. However, that being said, not all of them have general applications in Aetherites, for example. I know not a lot of people, at least that I am familiar with, tend to take that mode as seriously as maybe someone like me, for example. But anyway, to get back on point, I still think it would be more fun to look at this through a meta perspective rather than a general usage perspective, which even though this is how most people are going to go into this, I think it would be more of an interesting approach if I thought of it through like a competitive sense. So anyway, I'll go through each unit, give my thoughts on their fodder, and go from there. To start us off, we have Summer Caspar from the Three Houses path. Skill-wise, Summer Caspar doesn't really come with much. All he really has is Bonus Doubler. At least that's the most notable passive I can see from this chart. However, what I will say is that his value definitely lies in his weapon, Victor Fish Plus. As much of a meme weapon this may come off as, the fact that it buffs his defense stat while also decreasing the foe's defense stat means that he's essentially getting +5 attack and +5 defense during combat. And if the foe has any visible buff towards their defense, it basically gets neutralized and then added to Caspar, or whoever's using the Victor Fish. It's essentially like a binding necklace for defense, which is pretty interesting actually, because it means that you can generally output more damage against melee foes and tank more. And while you definitely have other similar weapons in the sense of like Love Candelabra, which can also provide supportive benefits because it's a joint drive attack and joint drive defense weapon, I would definitely say Victor Fish does have its own niche, and it's currently not a weapon that can be replicated by other inheritables. Honestly, for what it's worth, it's not like the craziest inheritable, but considering it's also on the 400 code path, I would say it's not a bad weapon by any means. Which is why I do think Caspar will get a check. Oh yeah, and I didn't specify how this is going to go. The check basically means for the amount of codes it costs, the value is there. Meanwhile, with the dash, I would say that while it will have value, I don't think it has enough value to warrant its check, but not enough worthlessness to warrant an X. That's kind of where it's going to be like the middle ground. And I know that's kind of like a cop-out sort of thing, but from what I see, it's one of those more like indecisive, I could kind of lean one way or the other, but considering it's not necessarily like the most expensive during the path, I'm willing to be more lenient with it. So in Bernadetta's case, right? She has attack speed solo 4. And generally, solos are fine, whatever. Meta-wise, solos are terrible. In Aetherites offense, you're generally bundling up because you have saves now, and most of the time, you're not really running any compositions without any saves unless it's Gale Force. And if you're running a Gale Force team, generally you want something with chip damage, so like Fury 4 or Attack Speed Push or whatever grants chip damage the most. So Attack Speed Solo doesn't necessarily have the most use on Aetherites offense these days. And while this can also be used on Aetherites defense, I would say there's more competitive options these days, especially with the line of catch skills. And while that's also a bit more expensive than solos, because clearly we get a bunch of them from this path, I would definitely say there's also the issue of units in turn order, where there's a chance that due to manipulation, whether that's with like Milla or Bride Fjorm or whatever the case may be, or even Elamine, there's a good chance that units can end up bundling together anyway, so it could end up rendering the skill worthless. However, she does come with speed res low, and I do think that has some value, even by today's standards, even with like the reverse debuff meta that we're kind of in with unities. I know Lols haven't exactly been in the like greatest estate lately. However, it still provides a -3 speed and res, on top of the fact that it also just prevents any sort of visible buffs to speed and res on the foe. However, generally, depending on your sports, most of the time you're generally stacking through invisible stats like spurs and drives. Like 2 examples I can easily think of are like Brave Lucina, or even the Bow Hinoka, not the green one, the colorless. But even so, it still provides extra damage output, and it helps with guaranteeing doubles. So you know what? For what it's worth, I don't think it's a bad manual at all, at least to the competitive side. However, I'm not really sold one way or the other, which is why I'm going to put a dash through it. And to be honest, Dimitri is kind of the same way. However, if it weren't for the fact that he has Odd Tempest, I probably would have slapped an X on him. Odd Tempest, for what it's worth, can be used for turn 1 hit and run shenanigans, where you can go in, attack a unit, possibly defeat them, run back into the safety fence, and boom, you're gold. I wouldn't say that the Tempest line skills are necessarily the best, especially when we can run other skills, depending on the class type, of course. If you're running it on a flyer, then you always have Rhine, so that could always be good for heavy blade checks. But if you're running on infantry, you have Times Pulse. But even so, I would definitely say that when it comes to general gale forcing, more often than not anyway, you're going to be positioning your units in a way where you're going to either smite them in or reposition them in. So it's not as if they're going to be able to go all the way in by themselves. Generally, they're going to be receiving some sort of support anyway. But yeah, outside of just hit and run shenanigans with safety fence abuse, I would definitely say that Odd Tempest is just a fine skill to have. And I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest connoisseur when it comes to Gilfer, so maybe it's not fair for me to say one way or the other. However, I do think, at least the way I see it, that the Tempest skills are generally better for hit and run shenanigans. Or at least even Tempest could be better for going in on turn 2 after you set up. Even so, I would still think that 3 movement isn't necessarily going to be enough without a positional assist anyway, especially with safety fence, because you're only able to move up one specific tile depending on where you placed your fence. But that's about it. Next we get to Halloween Rhea, and I think she actually has a fair amount of value. She has attack res unity, which can actually be fairly decent for a ranged specialist, so if you're using it on a Micaiah, for example, and she gets debuffs, she could just reverse it and take even more. Dragon Wall is also fairly decent if you want to use a dragon melee specialist, for example, or any notable dragon that can either act as an Omni Tank, despite Omni Tanks kind of falling out of meta, or a dragon armor such as Halloween Myrrh. I think the fact that it checks res over something like speed means it definitely has an easier time triggering, because a lot of the time most foes are going to be having lopsided defenses, generally with caps, for example. So one great example is Legendary Sigurd, who's pretty much everywhere. He has a lot of defense, he has lopsided res, you're going to get damage reduction off him, for example. But even Dragon Wall aside, attack res unity is still a really, really good skill for ranged specialists anyway, which is why I think Rhea deserves a check for this. I would say her father is fairly competitive for what it's worth. And then finally in the 3 houses path, we have Gatekeeper. I think this one's going to be harder to correlate, because if you look at his kit, it's definitely made for arena purposes. You have Harsh Command Plus, you have a 300 SPA, a 300 SPC, and you can pretty much get all the skills in one go. If you inherit regular Harsh Command with Drive Defense, you'll get all the skills. I would still say Close Reversal and Joint Drive Defense do have merit in Aether Raids in general. There is tech that you can use with ranged units that have fairly high defense with low res. You could use them as a near save, for example, albeit it's not necessarily the most amazing near save. But if we're talking about a unit such as plug-in Raphael, for example, he has really high defense, he has low res, he's fairly min-maxed in that regard, he has really high attack. You can use him as a near save unit, and honestly it may work out. I'm personally under the camp that plug-in Raphael doesn't really have the best far safe performance because of the fact that his res is really low. And even though you could patch it out with Spendthrift, for example, and double distance defense, mages are just hitting harder and harder every day. We just got Winter Lysithia a few months ago. So I do think there is merits for Close Reversal when it just comes to specific range units with lopsided defenses. And of course, if you're using this on a melee specialist anyway, Joint Drive Defense is not a bad option by any means, because you could just increase your longevity against melee foes. And most of the time, you're not really going up against dragons anyway because they're not common at all. Like outside of the mythic ones, you're not really going to run into them. So even outside of the potential speculation with close reversal, joint drag defense is still a relatively decent skill for melee specialists anyway. You could also use it for supporting your far safe support if you're running out on the melee specialist, for example. And to be honest, for what it's worth, I don't think it's a bad 2000 code pick. So for that reason, I think he's going to also get a check. And honestly, looking at it, like it's not a bad path by any means. I would say the Three Houses path it's fairly good. And then we'll get to the Awakening and Fates path. And while it definitely has value, I definitely think my hot take is going to piss off a lot of people, but we'll see what happens. I don't have much to say on Caden. He doesn't really have any good inheritables. Attack Defense Snag is generally not good supportive-wise because it only targets the nearest foe within 4 spaces and only debuffs them. As opposed to something like Ruse, which can hit 2 columns and also inflict guard, it definitely has a lot more value, which is why New Year Caden gets the first ever LOL. Congratulations. Let's go on to a unit that actually has value. Nyx. I already gave my spiel on solos in general, so I don't want to really trek over that again. However, for what it's worth, I would definitely say attack speed solo versus speed res solo. Attack speed solo definitely has more value. The res really is ever going to come into play unless if you're omni-tanking, and omni-tanking is kind of a dead strat nowadays because mages are hitting way too hard. And there's so much anti-damage reduction tech that where it's just not feasible anymore. However, what I would say separates Nyx from Winter Bernadetta is the fact that she has no follow-up. No follow-up is a fairly staple skill in Aetheraide's offense, where the mode is plagued with guaranteed follow-ups as well as follow-up prevention and so on and whatever. It's generally one of the more important skills you could run on Aetheraide's offense. Like one of the first examples that comes to mind is Legendary Sigurd. I know I used him as an example previously, but he's a prominent example because of how common he is. You also have Dual Lift with his guaranteed follow-up attack, and that's just to name a couple common ones. There's obviously more units like that, but considering how common they are, it wouldn't hurt just to have it around anyway, and it could always be nice for preventing like impact effects in general. And for that, I would definitely say Nyx does get a checkmark. I think her father has a bit more value than Bernadetta's, because no follow-up is more consistent in its nature when it comes to the overall meta, which is why I'll definitely say that even though Nyx has less skills and a worse solo, no follow-up makes up for it. And then we have Charlotte, who actually has really good fodder. She has Swift Swear 3, which is generally good. You have Frenzy, which is great for Gale Force strats because generally you want to be at least at 50%, so you can act as Wings of Mercy Beacon. It has Desperation too, that's fine. It also has innate damage reduction, which is totally fine for what it's worth. Even though the effect won't necessarily come into play in the enemy phase, it's still damage reduction at the end of the day. And then you have Time's Pulse, which is just a generally good skill. I would say this kit is definitely heavily designed for Gale Force strategies in mind, minus Swift Sparrow 3, of course, because your Wings of Mercy Beacon wants something like Fury 4 or anything that provides recoil damage because you want to act as Wings of Mercy Beacon, so you could fall below 50% HP, or at minimum just reach the 50% HP threshold. You could also do this with an Ardent Sacrifice strat with Winter Bernadetta, so you can always set up. And the fact that it's a Desperation damage reduction skill means that even if you don't defeat the foe on your first 2 hits, provided that you double, there's a good chance that you'll live a counterattack. For what it's worth, I would definitely say Frenzy and Time's Pulse is really, really good, especially for the 1200 codes that it costs. I would say it has a lot of good value. And now we get to my really hot take. I don't think Fallen Female Morgan has any value in this path. If anything, I think she kind of ruins the path up until a certain point, because obviously next we have Near Safe, which is really, really good. I already went into my spiel about solos. I'm not going to go over that again. Dive Bomb in Aetheraide's context isn't really a great skill anyway because of the strict threshold that it has that relies on both the foe and the ally to have at least 80% of their HP present. This won't work against units that either take a bit of damage, whether that's from like a Bolt Trap or Bolt Tower or whatever the case may be, or if you're setting up Ardent Sacrifice strats, but that's more of a Gale Force issue more than anything else. And the fact that it's locked to melee flyers means it's going to be hard for them to reach anyway, so chances are you're going to be entering other combats before they even reach you, which means chances are Dive Bomb is not going to go off the way you want it to. And Attack Defense Menace, this is also a hot take. I don't really think it's a crazy good skill, especially when you consider the fact that it only reliably targets one foe within 4 spaces. Obviously it can hit more than one foe, but the fact of the matter is that if you enter more than one combat, it's going to end up doing nothing in terms of consistency. And another hot take, I don't really think Menace skills are generally that good anyway. I do like them, And I know I use them, but just through a general perspective, I do think that you would prefer something more consistent because reliably, this is only going to hit one foe. And even though it does buff you visibly for attack and defense, there's so many skills and units that can give you visible buffs consistently to the point where you could just run something more consistent like attack, defense, Rhyme, for example. And this doesn't even cover the fact that if you even hit someone, right, they can still be protected by saves who don't even get the debuffs. It becomes even worse. I still think that if you're if the benefit you're looking at is visible buffs, you're better off running something completely else, or even just support in general, because it's not hard to just get visible buffs, especially with all the tactics that we have. You could run Peony, and even though it's not it's not as much visible buffs, you can still run other units that provide those kind of stats. And it's more consistent than something like Menace, which is why I do think in general her fodder is just not good. And again, I already prefaced this at the beginning. All these skills are usable in general. However, through a competitive sense, I don't think any of these skills have any applications. But enough of that. Let's get to a really good unit. We have Halloween Male Grima, who has Sturdy Stance 3, Slick, and Near Save. I don't think I really need to go into depth as to why Near Save is good. I think anyone who's fairly, has played the game within, a fair amount of time, at least knows by now that Near Save and Far Save are very, very amazing skills that allow other units to perform in other roles that they couldn't have prior. Sturdy Stance 3 is also really good. It provides a +6 attack and defense buff, and in Slick Fighter is always good for just negating debuffs. That's always great. Yeah, at the end of the tunnel, it's not all that bad. So for what it's worth, you can still get a Nyx, you can get a Charlotte, and Halloween Grima at the end of the tunnel, it's definitely worth the 2,000 codes. Next, we get to the Path of Radiance Radiant Dawn path. And I honestly think this may be the strongest path of the 6 that we have. Even when it comes to just the first 2 units that we have. Pirate Vika generally doesn't have much. She has Sabotage Attack, and while you can get that on a Grail unit, if I remember correctly, I think on Solo. At the end of the day, it's still a fairly decent support option, and you don't necessarily have to waste the Grails as much. However, I do want to state that the fact that it is way more easily accessible does weigh down the value a bit, in my opinion. However, because of the fact that, A, you're not wasting Grails, and it's only 400 codes, it's not the worst by any means, which is why I do think I'll just give it a neutral, or a dash, or whatever. And as I was going on earlier about Kaden and how ruses are better, we have a ruse. Rally attack defense plus, it's fine, you could use basically any rally or whatever. But honestly, ruses are fairly nice tech in general. You can inflict guard on foes within 2 columns. You can also debuff their attack and defense. Or you could even try this on Aetherraid's defense. I don't know how effective it'll be considering there's so much isolation with Mila on light. And then, even though there isn't a dedicated mythic for isolation, you can still use Bride Fuelworm on that season. So it's not always going to be the most consistent. However, for an Aetherraid's offense set, I don't think it's going to be a bad option. You can't run it on flyers, unfortunately, so if you were to give it to Thor, for example, with Love Candelabra, then I don't think, in that regard, it wouldn't be good, but you could always slap it on any other support unit. If you wanted to put it on Dagger, for example, and run her as a support unit with Love Candelabra, then it wouldn't be bad, even though she could also be used for a Gale Force, but she's fairly flexible in what she does anyway, because she is a mythic, so it's not as much of an opportunity cost, and she provides a slot, so it's not like it matters all too much in her case. But in any case, I would definitely say Ruse definitely has value, at the very least. Bond is Bond. I'm not going to go into that. And as far as Rally Pluses go, we get one every month, pretty much from the limited codes, so it's not necessarily the most premium thing. So I do think, for what it's worth, I'll also give her a dash. But then, we get into Winter Sephiran. And honestly, the thing that carries him is absolutely his weapon. You can slap this on an Aetherraid's defense team and make your foes prone to guard, which is actually fairly good, considering you can shut down Gale Force strategies that way, because of the fact that, unless they have a 2 cooldown special and they have unconditional Heavy Blade or whatever, some kind of support, they won't be able to Gale Force through unless you could set up instant Gale Force or Wings of Mercy Beacon. I think this can shut down a lot of strategies like that. I think it's pretty good. But outside of that, attack risk pushes, whatever, odd recovery is pretty much dead thanks to the fence, so it's not really going to have any value. And Earth Water Plus is, it's a healer skill, it's whatever. But definitely his value comes from Tandem Baton, being able to inflict guard on foes within 2 spaces. I think that's really, really strong. So for that, he gets another check mark. And then we have Volk, who actually has really, really good stuff. He has Sturdy Impact, he has Null Follow-Up, he has Times Pulse, and he has Lethality. This is all really, really, really good stuff. Sturdy Impact can be good for just shutting down guaranteed follow-up attacks, or it just doubles in general on Aetherite's defense. You have No Follow-Up, which is also just a staple skill, both for preventing guaranteed follow-up attacks and securing your own doubles. Times Pulse, as previously mentioned, that's also really good fodder because you could set up with Gale Force strats, or you could just, again, keep it on someone like Volk. Even though he's manual, you could just keep it on someone on Aetherite's defense. Even though it will probably get shut down by Elamine on Astra, you can always slap this on Light. And then, of course, you have Lethality, which is just a really, really strong anti-damage reduction tech skill in general. Volk has a lot of value. I think most people will agree on that end. Even if you don't want to use Lethality, you have Sturdy Impact, No Follow-Up, Times Pulse. If you don't want to use Times Pulse, you have No Follow-Up, Sturdy Impact, Lethality. There's so many options with his kit. And the fact that he only costs 1,600 codes is really, really good. And finally, on the Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn path, we have Pirate Naysala, who honestly definitely gets carried by their near trace. I already went through the solo shenanigans. I already talked my piece about solos. Stall Ploy honestly could have interesting tech. I don't know how common or viable it's going to be in comparison to running someone like Reeve. However, I do believe that Reeve does come with an opportunity cost, so there is merit to using Stall Ploy on a specific support unit. But that just depends on the unit, of course. Like, you could slap it on Bride Fjorm and she'll just shut down a lot of stuff. Or even a Versa, depending on when she gets her refined. But I would definitely say the most value comes from his speed, defense, near trace. That could also be really, really good for hit and run strategies, especially with Gale Force. You go in with Cavalry, for example, you attack, you trigger Gale Force, you attack again, and then you can essentially have up to 3 to 4 movement to run away, and then reposition that. And you're safe in the safety fence. Which is why I do think, yeah, no. Speed, defense, near trace has a lot of value. And I'm going to die on that hill. And honestly, I would definitely say, like, out of all the paths so far, this one is probably the best one we have right now. But let's go into one that's more interesting. We have the Blazing Binding Sacred Stones path, with Juno starting us off. Honestly, like, attack speed form that's fine. It won't cost you as much to get it now. It's only 400. Aerobatics is replaceable. But I do think the fact that she has Love Bouquet, which is basically a joint drive effect tone, is really good both combatively and supportively. So, for example, if you're running a Blue Tome Far Save unit, right, you can slap Love Bouquet on that unit, and they'll be able to not only provide themselves with extra attack and res, if I remember correctly, but they'll also be able to provide it to other allies, which is generally, it's a nice effect. It's a really nice effect. And to be honest, it may not be the craziest, but considering it's only the first one and it only costs 400, I would definitely give her a check mark. Next, we have Louise, who honestly doesn't have any bad stuff either. Ideal could actually be pretty decent because it does provide a maximum of +9 attack and speed, so that's never bad. However, I do think similar to Juno, her value comes from her weapon, where she is able to provide a ride effect within 2 spaces. This is going to be mainly in line with supportive flyers such as Ashnard, who provides Rhine effects from their weapon. And even though Rainbow provides speed and defense debuffs, this can actually still be relatively decent for Savvy Fighter support and Melee Specialist supports, for example. It's not bad by any means. And again, the fact that attack speed ideal provides upwards of +9 attack and speed, provided that both of the conditions are met, honestly could scale fairly well. But even so, I still think I'm going to mainly rank her for her inheritable weapon for supportive purposes. And again, because she's only 800 codes, I would definitely say she has enough value there to warrant a check. Now, Dusel, I think, kind of suffers the Winter Bernadetta situation where they both have a solo, they both have a lull. Basically, it's going to be the same thing. They both have a solo, it's kind of strict. There's always potential for it to mess up and not even work because you could end up being adjacent. Low attack defense is always nice, even though there are more competitive options nowadays. But even then, being able to inflict -3 attack and defense and negate any sort of buff to attack and defense is always nice. And it can allow other units that target defense to hit harder in general, so it's not even that bad. But again, because of the fact that a lot of units also use spurs and drives and the like, it's not necessarily going to come into effect as much as you would hope it would. It's only 1,200 codes, but even so, 1,200 codes, while not the best, not the worst, I still think he kind of falls in line with like the middle of the pack, where it's not necessarily bad, but it's not necessarily amazing, especially at 1,200 value. But then we get the Bard Shana, and honestly, I would definitely say her value comes from attack defense Rhine and Swispera 3. Far Trace in general isn't necessarily the best unless you're on a cav, but even then it's kind of strict depending on how much you move, because of the fact that there isn't a remaining cancel effect. On ranged flyers, it's even worse because of the fact that they can't even use Tempest skills, so they're stuck with the 2 movement, and chances are they're not going to be very good hit and run units anyway. However, Attack Defense Run is a consistent debuffing C slot that can actually be really, really good, not only for supportive capabilities, but for melee specialists, and even flyer melee specialists. So I don't think it's bad at all. In fact, I do think it's a really good skill. It's consistent, especially if you enter multiple combats, unlike Menace, so you end up doing a lot more. And this can actually be really good for heavy blade checks on offense if you really want to slap it on a flyer, for example. So if you put it on Altina and use her for Gale Force, this wouldn't be bad. Of course, you could also use her. You could also use her with Thor, and she won't really need heavy blade, but it's still good nonetheless. It's consistent debuffing in attack and defense. And you also have Swift Spare 3, which just provides a flat +6 and +6/+7 attack speed, which isn't bad by any means. So yeah, outside of the Far Trace, I would definitely say Bright Shanna definitely has a lot of value, and for what it's worth, 1600 codes for that is not bad. And then we get to Young La Rochelle, who honestly I think kind of devalues the path. Everyone's favorite attack speed push 4, it's fine, it does the job. However, at 2000 codes, I would prefer something that's just overall better. You could use it on Stabes, obviously, but attack speed push 4 is so commonplace that you don't necessarily need to spend 6,000 codes to get it. And I say 6,000 because you still need to spend the 4,000 prerequisite 4,000 codes with Juno, Luis, Dusel, and Bride Shanna to even get to that point. I already mentioned that Far Trace isn't necessarily great unless it's on cavalry units, and even then, it's only going to do as much as a lull if you already max out your movement. So it's not even the craziest, especially for hit and run strategies. You're better off with Near Trace because of the remaining cancer, and you can use Gale Force off that. And then you also have Rescue Plus, which I don't really see the value in, because of the fact that A, it has harder applications than Aether Raid's defense nowadays, because of the fact that Safety Fence exists, you can't abuse Winter Bernadetta, it can get shut down by Isolation, and it's easily manipulatable. And on Aether Raid's offense, I don't really see how this is better than any regular healing assist because of the fact that if you're using it for Gale Force, for example, you don't want to heal anyway. You want something that just actually provides a positional assist without the healing benefit. And if you're just healing for general tanking, you could just use any other skill. You don't need to spend 6,000 codes just to get Rescue Plus. But who knows? I'm not seeing the value in it. And to be honest, for what it's worth, at 2,000 codes, it's not really worthwhile in my opinion. And you could still skip over it, of course. You could always go to a new path. However, I still think that, after spending all those codes, you would think at the end of the tunnel you would want something that's worthwhile. And this isn't me calling the fodder by any means, because it does have its applications. However, I do think that, for what it's worth, A, attack speed push is way too commonplace, and you just have better options in general, such as Catch. And in Far Trace in general, compared to Near Trace, is not really that good of a skill. Which is why I'm going to reward Young La Rochelle with the second ever LOL rating. Maybe I'm being harsh, I could be. However, I do think at the end of the tunnel, you would want something that's more competitive. And maybe I'm crazy to think about that, but if you're spending 6,000 codes and you're saving all this time just to get at the end, and then you get stuff like that, then it's not really worth it. Even though the fodder itself isn't bad by any means. It's just the fact that you could have just spent it on any other path. But in any case, we'll move on to the Heroes, Genealogy, and Thracia path. First off, we start out with Scion Lune. And to be honest, he doesn't really have much going for him. Drifting Grace Plus is a whatever tome. It provides attack speed and heals plus 10 HP at the start of every turn. Doesn't really do much. It's whatever. Attack for solo, mid, and Infantry Flash. You will have so many skills and support that can just provide unconditional cooldown, so it's not really that great. If you want him for a merge, go for it. I'm probably going to get him for a merge because mine has a Res Bane, but outside of that, no, I don't think he really has value. But then we get to all the rest, right? We start with Asbel. And honestly, he has a lot of value. He has Fury 4, which can be really good for setting up chip damage and Wings of Mercy beacons. He has No Follow-Up, which is just a generally good skill on Aether Raid's offense anyway. He has Speed Res Oath, which is Speed Res Oath. I'm not going to go into that one. I was going to make a joke, but I don't really have anything to say on it. Yeah, no, Fury 4, providing the most recoil damage out of any current skill that we have in the game, is really, really good. You can stack that up with a Fury 3 seal, and you can end up essentially taking a lot of chip damage per combat, which can make it really, really easy to fall into the Wings of Mercy beacon. But yeah, it's simple as that. I would definitely give him the checkmark. He's definitely one of the better 800 code value packs that we have. And then we get to Scion Larce, who also has a lot of value. I already talked about how Frenzy is actually a fairly decent skill. At the end of the day, it's damage reduction. You could also use it for Gale Force strategies. And Joint Trap Attack is a fundamentally really good skill in general, especially if you use it for melee specialists or range specialists or whatever you want to use. Anything that isn't really armor or flyer because they have rinds and saves. But Joint Drive Attack is just a universally good skill anyway and can be really, really good for melee specialists. So yes, she also gets a check mark. I'm not going to go too in-depth about Frenzy again because I already covered it with Charlotte. I don't feel like I need to rinse and repeat myself. And then we get to Sarah. And I already said my piece with the Lara Shell, right? I don't think the positional healing specials really have as much value as they once did. Attack speed push 4 is pretty much on everyone. However, I would say the core difference between someone like Sarah and Lara Shell is that she has Joint Drive Res, which I still think has a lot of value at the end of the day. You can use it, again, on ranked specialists. You can make them even more bulky. It also provides additional buffs to save allies, so that's that's great. Dazzling Staff is whatever. I'm not really going to go into that because most Cav healers worth their salt already have one or the other anyway in their kit, so it's not really worth like that much. And we generally get Wrathful or Dazzling one way or the other through the codes every so often. But yes, I would say the fact that she doesn't cost 2,000 codes, or I guess 6,000 codes or whatever, I would say it's not a bad, I wouldn't say it's bad by any means. I'm kind of hesitant one way or the other as to whether or not I'd give her a check mark or a dash, but I think for what it's worth, 1,600 codes, Joint Drive Res, that's perfectly fine. I think, like, at the end of the day, it's not that bad. But I could honestly lean one way or the other, especially with the fact that, again, attack speed push is commonplace on everyone, and you already have so many more competitive options. Yeah, no, I would definitely say, like, she definitely either falls between, like, mid or just fairly valuable, but I'll have to, like, secure my thought on that one later, because I'm kind of indifferent one way or the other. And then we get to Henriette, who, similar to male Halloween Grima, has a lot of value because they have a save skill. Far Save is really good. Slick Fighter I already talked about. Distant Defense 4, really, really good. But yeah, I don't really think I need to go too in-depth with this. The fact that Far Save exists means that you can run Melee Specialist and open up more roles to units in general. So, like, you could run a Lucas. Like, you never thought one day you could run a Lucas like this. You can run Lucas with a Far Save support and he'd do just fine. And the fact that you could get both Distant Defense 4 and Slick, or Distant Defense 4 and Far Save, probably the latter you want. It's really, really good. Slick Fighter is also just a generally good fighter skill, which is why I'll give her a check mark. But then we get into the final path of Heroes, Mysteries, Shadows, right? And I already prefaced this at the beginning by saying that, yeah, this isn't like a general use thing. This is a more competitive aspect. And the thing is I look at, like, Blue Dual Infantry 3, right? And it's not a bad skill. You could get it, and you could inherit a Marianne and get Joint Drive Res as well, so that's always good for scoring. However, in contrast to that, I do think that because we're already hitting 185 BST demotes, that having the ability to get 180 BST from a dual skill isn't necessarily as competitive and is only going to age worse. But again, this isn't like an arena thing. For arena purposes, this is great. Get yourself a Marianne, slap it on any unit you want, maybe a Noe or whatever. It goes off, right? But like through a competitive sense, it's just whatever. Like, it doesn't really have any applications. Because at the end of the day, it's just HP plus 5. So yeah, no, I would definitely say Berkut gets the X. He gets an X. And then we get the plug-in Katarina, who has attack speed solo 4, chill defense res, and attack res Rhine. Honestly, is only really carried by attack res Rhine, because similarly to how I was talking about Bright Shana, it's just a generally consistent debuffing skill. Chill defense res is a meme. It's a meme. I'm not going to go over that. Attack is, and again, with another solo, like, there's so many solos in this path. But yeah, no, the fact that it's an 800 code attack res Rhine means that it's not bad at all. In fact, I would definitely say it's fairly good. You can also use it supportively, albeit to a certain extent and only with flyers, because again, it is a Rhine skill. But yeah, no, this isn't a bad skill at all. I would definitely say, for what it's worth, at 800 codes, or 1200, or however you want to look at it, it definitely has enough value there. So I would definitely say attack res Rhine definitely carries it. And I know I already went on my spiel about menaces and lulls or whatever, but here's where it's going to differ. I'm going to give Zeke the check as well because of the fact that he comes with attack defense catch. Attack defense catch provides a really, really good amount of attack and defense. It can provide up to 9 attack and defense. And it's fairly simple to set up because of penalties, and it relies on the foe being at 100%. So worst case scenario, you could always get like +7, which is still a really big stat swing. And it doesn't have any sort of like solo condition or whatever, so you don't have to worry about positioning. And yeah, that's pretty much the extent of it. It provides a lot. It's definitely better than solos. You can stack up your attack and defense, and you can end up surviving a lot more melee stuff in general. It's not bad by any means at all. In fact, I do think it's fairly good. And while I did definitely have Dusel as like indecisive, like dash, middle, whatever, I think what differentiates Zeke from Dusel is the fact that he comes with attack defense catch, which I do value more, at least through a competitive sense. So for that, I'll give Zeke the check mark. And then to keep it simple and short for Summer Freya, she has Fatal Smoke. That's just a really, really good Aetherite's defense, like tech in general. You don't always have to just rely on Legendary Sigurd or Dual Left or Moose Spell if you run that. The fact that you can inherit Fatal Smoke to anyone else as well means that it's going to drill the idea of just healing in general in Aetherite's offense as moot. So yeah, no, Fatal Smoke definitely has its value, especially at 1600, and even though attack speed solo is like, whatever, I would definitely say to a competitive aspect that Fatal Smoke definitely has a lot of value, which is why I'm also going to give her a check mark. And then I'm going to get to my second hot take, right? We're going to go to, or I don't even know if it's second, third, fourth, I don't even know what I'm on, right? I already discussed before about how Omni-taking in general has just kind of fallen off. You can use Distant Counter on like far save units, for example, kind of similar to how you can use Close Reversal on someone like Plug-in Raphael, for example, with who has lopsided defense and res. So there's like merit to running him as a near save if possible. However, in Brave Marth's case, I think the fact that you need 6,000 codes to get to him specifically is what drives away a lot of value. Distant Counter is always nice to have. I'm not going to argue that, even though it's like not necessarily the most competitive skill that we have right now. Distant Pressure is just not good. Like, it's fine on specific units that are like attempting to speed stack, but the fact that it has chip damage kind of just ruins it. Spurn is fine, but you're also competing with competitive slots such as Null Follow-Up, which is generally more preferred. If you can already stack up your natural bulk anyway, then Spurn isn't really going to come into play. And even though a lot of units with guaranteed follow-ups tend to be slow as is, there is more merit to just having natural bulk over something that provides, especially when you consider the fact that units like Not, for example, who have attack speed menace, which most people tend to keep on their defense anyway, can just mitigate any sort of damage reduction because she also has bonus doubler in her weapon. So she's going to be, chances are she's going to be outspeeding most foes in general. It's not going to be that hard. So Spurn isn't really going to be coming into play all too much, which is why I also do think that skills like Dragon Wall have a bit more value than Spurn because most foes on Aetherite's defense are not stacking up their res. And then I already covered this with Odd Tempest, but the fact that Even Tempest only works on even turns is just, like, I don't see as much value in it as I do with Odd Tempest. At least with Odd Tempest, you could go in turn 1, you could hit and run, and you retreat back to a safe defense, right? But after turn 1, the safe defense doesn't even work. And you could still use even, like, you could still argue that maybe using Even Tempest on turn 2 after setting up, like, Winter Bernadetta with, like, Gale Force strategies. But at the end of the day, you're still using some sort of positional assist to get them in the face of the enemy, because, again, you can't just reach with 3 movement. That's not going to be enough. And you can still argue that you could get Distant Counter and Spurn by itself, but the fact of the matter is that because it costs 6,000 codes just to get to that point, and the fact that there are already more competitive options because of the fact that A, you're using saves a lot of the time in this meta, and B, you have to compete with the likes of Null Follow-Up, at least depending on like the type of, like if you have a PRF that has like Null Follow-Up in it or something like that, then that's different. But in general, you're still competing between Null Follow-Up and Spurn anyway. So I do think that at the end of the day, for 6,000 codes, right now, Brave Marth is not worth it. But anyway, I went in on this big old long spiel about my thoughts on the Divine Codes, Part 3, whatever. And if I had to rank them, I would definitely say Genealogy and Thracia have the most value, probably followed by the Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn Path, and then maybe either Three Houses or Awakening. But like after that, it's just kind of up to like personal preference, in my opinion. Because honestly, like they all have their duds, but they also have their perks. So let me know what you think down below. Also, if you have a hot take counter, if you've been keeping track, let me know because I'm actually curious. I don't really know how many hot takes I made. Yeah, no, just let me know what your thoughts are because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of people that disagree, and I genuinely want to know your perspective because at the end of the day, I'm just one person with my own thoughts and opinions. So, yeah, let me know what you think down below. Thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did. Subscribe, like, do whatever, and I'll see you next time.